What if the place meant to protect you turned into a prison? This is the true story of a teenager who risked everything to escape an abusive special needs facility. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe every voice deserves to be heard. In the heart of Ouachita Parish, just outside Monroe, Louisiana, stood a facility that few locals spoke of openly. Hollow Creek Rehabilitation Center blended into the landscape, a low, sprawling cluster of aging brick buildings surrounded by dense pine woods. It was advertised as a safe haven for teens with developmental delays and behavioral challenges, a place where healing and growth could happen away from the chaos of everyday life. But for those trapped behind its locked gates, it was something far darker. Jacob, a soft-spoken 15-year-old from Little Rock, Arkansas, never imagined he'd end up somewhere like Hollow Creek. His parents had struggled for years, overwhelmed by his needs and manipulated by glossy brochures that promised specialized care. With heavy hearts and hopeful minds, they signed the papers that would change his life forever. The drive to the facility was long and silent. Jacob stared out the window at endless stretches of forest, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. When they pulled into the cracked parking lot of Hollow Creek, the building looked more like a decaying warehouse than a center of healing. Rusted fences loomed high, topped with coils of barbed wire that glinted under the gray Louisiana sky. 2 uniformed staff members approached immediately. Their expressions were hard, professional, and cold. Without a smile or greeting, they motioned Jacob forward. His mother tried to give him one last hug, but they shook their heads sternly. "No contact beyond this point," one said curtly. Tears welled up in his mother's eyes, but she obeyed. Jacob was led through a heavy metal door that clanged shut behind him, with a finality that made his heart race. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and something sour, like old sweat and despair. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, sickly glow. His intake process was clinical and dehumanizing. Staff confiscated his few belongings: a worn paperback novel, a sketchbook, and a set of headphones his father had given him. "Distractions," the staff said, tossing them into a bin without a second glance. They issued him scratchy institutional clothing and thin, plastic-soled shoes. Jacob was then marched to his assigned room, a narrow cell with a metal bed bolted to the floor, a thin mattress, and a toilet in the corner with no privacy curtain. The window, small and barred, allowed only a sliver of murky daylight to creep in. The orientation was brief. A supervisor, a burly man named Mr. Walker, barked out the rules: absolute obedience, no talking without permission, no touching other residents, and zero tolerance for non-compliance. Punishments, he made clear, were swift and severe. There was no mention of therapy, no classes, no hope. That first night, Jacob lay awake, shivering under a threadbare blanket. Through the thin walls, he could hear muffled cries and the occasional harsh shout of a guard. The sounds of fear soaked the air like humidity, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, Jacob was assigned to grounds duty, one of the many forms of forced labor disguised as therapy. For hours, he picked up trash along the fence line under the unrelenting sun. His skin burned and his hands blistered. But when he slowed, a staff member yelled at him to move faster. Lunch, a gray lump of unidentifiable food, offered little respite. Days at Hollow Creek blended into one another in a blur of exhaustion, fear, and routine humiliation. Jacob witnessed a teenage girl named Emily being dragged out of line for looking up without permission. Another boy, Tyler, was forced to scrub bathroom floors with a toothbrush for disrespecting staff. Attempts to resist were crushed swiftly. Staff worked in pairs, ensuring that no resident was ever out of sight, and every corridor was watched by cameras. The children learned quickly that crying only made things worse. Showing pain, showing humanity, these were acts of rebellion that would not be tolerated. The facility itself was a labyrinth of locked doors and narrow hallways. Posters plastered on the walls proclaimed slogans like "respect through compliance" and "healing through discipline," bitter mockeries of what really happened inside. Jacob realized that escape from abusive facility was not just a phrase. It was the desperate wish in every silent glance exchanged between the teens. Outside visitors were rare and tightly controlled. If inspectors arrived, residents were ordered to smile, to parrot lines about how grateful they were, and to stay silent about the bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Staff threatened them with solitary confinement or loss of privileges, things like a 5-minute phone call home, if they dared to tell the truth. Each night, Jacob lay on his cot and made mental notes. The times the guards changed shifts, the places where the fence seemed lower, the weak spots in the surveillance coverage. Somewhere deep inside, a plan began to form. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about getting out. And somehow, despite the walls, the locks, the guards, and the darkness, Jacob promised himself he would find a way. The first night of terror, Jacob sat on the edge of the cold metal bed in his assigned room, staring at the bolted door that had slammed shut behind him. The thin mattress sagged under his small frame, and the scratchy blanket offered little warmth against the chilling air that seeped through the cracked window. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something much worse. Fear. Real, consuming fear. The sun had barely set when the loudspeaker crackled to life. A voice, sharp and commanding, filled the corridors. Lights out. No talking. No movement. The fluorescent bulbs above flickered and died, plunging the room into a dim twilight, lit only by the ghostly glow of the emergency lights. Jacob pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, willing himself to disappear. From beyond the walls, muffled sounds echoed. Quiet sobs, harsh commands, the thud of boots against concrete floors. Every sound carried the weight of unseen horrors, and Jacob knew instinctively there was no safety here, not even in sleep. Around midnight, the terror began in earnest. Through the thin door, Jacob heard the first sharp cry, a boy's voice, cracked with terror, pleading, "Please, I'll do better." Then a heavy slam. Footsteps. Silence. His heart pounded against his ribs so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. Without understanding exactly how, Jacob realized that Hollow Creek didn't just survive on silence. It thrived on fear. Fear was a tool, sharpened and wielded by the staff to ensure total submission. Compliance through terror, respect through obedience. Hollow slogans he had seen on the peeling posters in the hallway now took on a cruel new meaning. Jacob shifted under his blanket, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. His mind raced with thoughts of his parents. Did they know? Were they lied to, like he had been? He imagined them at home, trusting, unaware of the special needs exploitation happening inside these walls. Suddenly, heavy footsteps approached his door. He froze. The door handle jiggled. A click. The door swung open just a few inches. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, landing squarely on Jacob's face. He squeezed his eyes shut, trembling, too afraid to move. "Stay quiet," a gruff voice muttered. Then the door slammed shut again, leaving Jacob in deeper darkness than before. The message was clear. They were always watching. In the neighboring rooms, the sounds of punishment continued. Jacob could hear a girl sobbing uncontrollably, her cries muffled but raw. Staff members barked insults and orders, their voices a blend of cruelty and boredom. No one comforted the children. No one cared. At Hollow Creek, suffering was normal. Expected. Jacob pulled the blanket over his head, but he couldn't block out the sounds. The terror gnawed at him, making it impossible to sleep. He thought about the posters again, about the hollow promises of healing through discipline. The real discipline here was degradation, a systematic breaking of spirit. Hours dragged by like years. Jacob watched the faint light shift across the floor, marking the slow crawl of night. His body ached from tension. His mind screamed to escape. But he had nowhere to go, locked inside a nightmare built specifically to trap him. Somewhere in the early morning hours, the cries finally stopped. An eerie, heavy silence settled over the building. But Jacob didn't relax. He knew now that silence wasn't peace. It was the calm between storms. When the morning announcement blared through the speakers, Jacob hadn't slept a second. "Wake up! Line up outside your doors, hands behind your back, no talking." He shuffled to the door, head down, hands clasped. The hallway was a grim parade of exhausted children. Eyes red and swollen, faces blank, shoulders slumped. No words were spoken, no glances exchanged. Fear hung over them like a heavy curtain. Staff members patrolled up and down the line, barking orders, correcting posture, snapping at any perceived sign of disobedience. Jacob saw Emily, the girl he had noticed during intake, her face pale and her hands trembling. Further down, he spotted Tyler, the boy forced to clean floors, standing stiff and silent. Breakfast was served in a large cafeteria that resembled a prison mess hall more than a dining area. Food was slapped onto plastic trays without care. A gray scoop of oatmeal, a single piece of dry toast, a carton of milk that tasted sour. They ate in silence, heads bowed. Speaking would invite punishment. After breakfast, Jacob was assigned to orientation counseling, a cruel joke of a session designed not to help, but to indoctrinate. He and 10 other new arrivals were herded into a stark room with peeling walls and broken chairs. At the front stood Mr. Walker, arms crossed, face set in a permanent scowl. "You're here because you failed outside," he said bluntly. "Out there, you were a burden. Here, you'll learn to be useful. You'll learn discipline. And if you don't, well," he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but understood. Jacob felt the weight of every word. He was not here to heal. He was here to be reshaped into something small, compliant, silent. The rest of the day followed the same brutal rhythm. Forced labor disguised as therapy, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of punishment. Hollow Creek's mission wasn't rehabilitation, it was control, exploiting special needs, teens under the false banner of treatment. That night, as Jacob lay back on his cot, exhausted beyond words, he realized the truth. Survival here wasn't just about following orders. It was about holding on to the last pieces of himself, the parts they wanted to erase. And somewhere deep inside, past the fear and the exhaustion, a tiny ember of resistance flickered. They might control his body, but his spirit? Not without a fight. The escape plan. The days at Hollow Creek blurred together, a monotonous rhythm of forced labor, silent meals, and sleepless nights soaked in fear. For Jacob, each passing hour felt heavier than the last. Every task he performed, every rule he obeyed, every punishment he witnessed, they all fed the growing fire inside him. A fire that whispered one word louder with each beat of his heart. Escape. Jacob knew survival wasn't enough anymore. Living under constant surveillance, suffering daily humiliation, and watching the spirit being crushed out of boys and girls like Emily and Tyler was unbearable. He couldn't just endure it. He had to get out. He had to escape from this abusive facility, even if the odds were against him. But escape from Hollow Creek wasn't something that could be done on impulse. The staff were vigilant. The fences were high, crowned with barbed wire. Security cameras watched every corridor, every courtyard, every entrance and exit. Even the woods beyond the compound, thick and dark, seemed like a living barrier, swallowing anyone foolish enough to try running. Jacob started planning silently, secretly, using every scrap of observation he could gather. He watched the staff closely. He memorized their shifts, their routines, their blind spots. He noted which guards were lazy, which ones got distracted during the evening rounds. He learned the weaknesses of the facility, the side gates rusted by years of rain, the dead zones where cameras failed to catch full views. During grounds duty, while pretending to rake leaves along the perimeter, Jacob discovered that the fence behind the maintenance shed sagged slightly where the earth had eroded beneath it. The gap was small, barely noticeable, unless you knew exactly where to look. But to someone desperate enough, it could be the difference between freedom and endless captivity. He didn't trust anyone with his plan, not even Tyler or Emily. He couldn't risk it. If a single word slipped out, staff would tighten security, and his slim chance would vanish. The fear of betrayal gnawed at him as much as the fear of failure. Jacob also started studying the woods during his rare moments outside. Thick pines towered around Hollow Creek, their dense branches forming a near impenetrable canopy. The ground was tangled with roots, underbrush, and hidden ravines. The forest wasn't just dark. It was alive, filled with dangers he couldn't predict. But beyond the trees, Jacob knew, lay the town of Monroe. Somewhere beyond the suffocating forest was a gas station, a road, a police station, someone who could help. The facility was isolated, but not completely cut off from the world. Still, the thought of navigating the woods alone, at night, without a flashlight or supplies, was terrifying. He could get lost, he could fall, he could die, but staying meant dying slowly, piece by piece, soul first. He chose the night carefully. It had to be one when the weather turned. A rainy night, when the guards would be grumpier, more inclined to stay indoors during rounds. Rain would cover his footsteps, blur the security footage, muffle the sounds of his escape. The day came sooner than he expected. Gray clouds gathered early that morning, hanging low and heavy over Hollow Creek. By afternoon, a steady, chilling rain began to fall, soaking the ground, turning the red dirt into thick, sucking mud. During evening chores, Jacob checked the maintenance shed again. The fence sagged more than before, heavy with rainwater. His heart pounded. This was it. Dinner was a tasteless mess of overcooked rice and watery beans. Jacob forced himself to eat. He would need the energy. Back in his room, lying on the cot, he went over the plan again and again in his mind. Wait for final bed checks. Count to 500 to be sure the guards were gone. Slip out the window. The small, barred window he had spent nights loosening, millimeter by painstaking millimeter. Weeks of work had weakened the bolts enough that tonight, under the cover of darkness and storm, he might finally pry them free. Jacob's hands shook as he waited. The speaker crackled. "Lights out!" He counted, slowly, deliberately. When he reached 500, he moved. He slid off the cot, padding silently to the window. His fingers found the loose bolts. Gently, carefully, he worked the frame free. The final bolt gave way with a soft, metallic pop. Jacob squeezed through the opening, scraping his arms against the rough metal. The rain hit his face like cold needles. The ground was slick, pulling at his shoes as he stumbled toward the maintenance shed. Every step was a battle against panic. He expected at any moment to hear the shout of discovery, the pounding of boots, the blinding glare of flashlights. But the night was on his side. He reached the sagging fence, dropped to his knees, and began digging frantically, widening the gap with his hands. Mud smeared his clothes, clogged his nails. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Finally, with one desperate push, he wriggled under the fence, tearing his shirt and scraping his skin. Freedom. Almost. The woods loomed before him, black and endless. No lights, no paths. Jacob hesitated for just a heartbeat. Then he plunged into the trees. Branches tore at his arms and face. Roots snagged his shoes. The rain blurred his vision. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to find shelter. But he kept moving, driven by the image of Monroe, by the faint hope of a road, of help, of someone believing his story about special needs exploitation. The facility would discover his escape soon. He had maybe an hour, maybe less. Jacob pushed deeper into the forest, guided only by gut instinct and desperate prayer. He was out, but he wasn't safe yet. The true test had only just begun. Journey through the forest, alone. Jacob plunged into the woods with nothing but the soaked clothes on his back and the desperate pounding of his heart guiding him forward. The forest outside Hollow Creek was a sprawling, tangled wilderness, dense, dark, and merciless. Rain fell in sheets, blurring everything into shifting shadows and muddy outlines. Branches whipped at his arms and face. The ground beneath him was slippery and treacherous, turning every step into a fight against falling. But Jacob didn't stop. He couldn't. Somewhere beyond this endless forest was hope, a road, a town, maybe even someone who would listen to the story he carried like a weight inside him. The truth about the special needs abuse hidden behind Hollow Creek's locked gates. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and rotting leaves. Every sound seemed amplified in the rain. The snapping of twigs underfoot, the distant rumble of thunder, the eerie calls of unseen animals. Jacob stumbled blindly, his soaked sneakers squelching with every step. There was no path, no sense of direction, only the primal instinct to move forward, away from the nightmare he had escaped. Fear clawed at him with every heartbeat. The deeper he went into the forest, the easier it was to believe he might never find his way out. He imagined staff members searching for him, dogs barking, flashlights sweeping through the trees. If they caught him, there would be no second chance. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time lost all meaning in the storm. Jacob slipped and fell hard against the muddy earth, his hands sinking into the cold, slimy ground. For a moment he lay there, the rain pouring onto his back, soaking him to the bone. His body screamed for rest. His mind screamed for survival. He pushed himself up, trembling but determined. Giving up meant going back. Going back meant disappearing forever. Somewhere through the curtain of trees, Jacob caught a glimpse of something. A thin thread of light, far in the distance. Was it real? Or just another cruel trick of the rain and darkness? Gritting his teeth, he moved toward it, each step heavier than the last. Thorns tore at his legs. Branches scratched his face. His lungs burned with every breath. In moments of weakness, his mind drifted back to the faces he had left behind. Emily's wide, terrified eyes, Tyler's silent, exhausted stare. They were still trapped, still suffering. Jacob's escape wasn't just for him anymore. If he could reach help, he could expose Hollow Creek, stop the exploitation that thrived in silence. The key phrases he had once read in pamphlets, safe rehabilitation, specialized care, therapeutic community, were now bitter lies in his mind. He had lived the truth. He had survived the exploitation that was carefully hidden behind polished brochures and smiling promises. His legs gave out again, and he collapsed against a fallen tree. For a long moment, Jacob simply sat there, too exhausted to move. Tears mingled with the rain on his cheeks. He thought of home, of his mother's voice, of his father's laugh. Did they know? Would they forgive him for running? Would they believe him when he told them what Hollow Creek really was? The thought gave him a small surge of strength. He couldn't die out here. Not now. He forced himself to his feet, staggering forward, each step an act of sheer will. As he moved deeper into the woods, the rain began to lighten, fading to a cold drizzle. Jacob's soaked clothes clung to his skin, weighing him down, but the slight improvement in visibility gave him hope. He could see the faint outlines of the trees now, the uneven dips and rises of the forest floor. Somewhere ahead, there had to be a road. He remembered from the orientation session. If you followed the river south, it would eventually cross a service road leading into Monroe. He needed to find that river. Listening carefully, Jacob strained to hear over the whispering rain and distant thunder. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint but steady, the unmistakable sound of rushing water. He turned toward the sound, moving as quickly as he could manage through the undergrowth. Every stumble, every scratch was worth it if it brought him closer to freedom. After what felt like hours, he broke through a thicket and saw it. A narrow, muddy river, swollen from the rain, carving its way through the forest. Relief flooded him so suddenly it nearly dropped him to his knees. The river was dangerous, fast, and angry under the storm, but it was also his guide. If he could follow it, he could survive. Jacob kept close to the riverbank, weaving through trees and rocks, sometimes slipping into the mud, sometimes crawling when the terrain became too rough. Every nerve in his body screamed for rest, for food, for warmth. But the image of Hollow Creek, the barbed wire, the shouting guards, the broken children, pushed him onward. He was escaping not just for himself, but for everyone who couldn't. Night pressed down heavier, and exhaustion blurred the edges of reality. Shapes twisted in the dark. Whispers curled through the trees. Fear gnawed at him, urging him to give up, to lie down and let the forest swallow him. But Jacob refused, one foot in front of the other, one breath at a time. Finally, as the forest began to thin, Jacob saw it, the faint glow of headlights cutting through the misty darkness. A road. Civilization. Help. Hope. His legs buckled with relief. But he pushed forward, stumbling through the last line of trees, crashing onto the rough asphalt of a narrow service road. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, through the haze of rain and exhaustion, he saw it, the distant shape of a building, the gleam of a sign, the promise of salvation. Jacob wasn't safe yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't trapped anymore. He had made it through the forest, alone, against all odds. Encounter with the police. Jacob lay sprawled across the rough asphalt of the narrow service road, gasping for breath. The cold rain soaked him through, and every inch of his body ached from exhaustion, cuts and bruises. His limbs trembled uncontrollably, part from the chill, part from sheer terror. He had escaped the forest, but the battle wasn't over. He was alone, a soaking, shivering boy in the middle of nowhere, a runaway from a special needs rehabilitation center that thrived on cruelty and silence. For a few agonizing minutes, Jacob simply lay there, staring up at the black sky, trying to summon the strength to move. Then, through the drizzle, he saw headlights approaching, two sharp beams cutting through the darkness. Panic surged through him. Were they looking for him? Had the Hollow Creek staff already alerted search teams? Were they coming to drag him back? Instinct screamed at him to crawl into the trees, to hide, but some deeper voice urged him to stay. He forced himself to sit up, waving one weak arm toward the oncoming vehicle. It was a police cruiser. The unmistakable black and white shape coming into view as it slowed, tires hissing against the wet road. The car stopped a few yards away. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the rain and Jacob's ragged breathing. Then the driver's door opened, and a tall man in a sheriff's department jacket stepped out, hand hovering near his radio. The deputy's face was cautious, but concerned as he approached. He was young, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes that quickly took in Jacob's disheveled state. The torn, mud-smeared clothing, the scratches on his arms, the haunted, desperate look in his eyes. "You okay, son?" the officer asked, voice low and steady. Jacob opened his mouth, but at first no sound came out. His throat was raw, his words tangled in panic and exhaustion. He shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain. "Help," he finally rasped, the word barely audible. "Please, help me." The deputy knelt down beside him, one hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you. I promise." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob believed it. The deputy helped him to his feet and gently guided him into the back seat of the cruiser. The seat was cold against Jacob's soaked clothes, but he hardly noticed. He curled into himself, trembling, overwhelmed by a storm of emotions: relief, fear, hope. As the deputy climbed back behind the wheel, he spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I've got a juvenile, approximately 15 years old, found on the service road near Hollow Creek. He's in bad shape, requesting medical and additional units." Static crackled in response. Jacob barely heard it. He was drifting, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a wall. But he snapped back to attention when the deputy turned to him. "Can you tell me your name?" the officer asked gently. "Jacob," he whispered. "Jacob Reed." "Okay, Jacob. You're doing great. Just hang in there, all right?" Jacob nodded weakly, clutching the rough seatbelt across his lap like a lifeline. As the cruiser pulled onto the road, the world outside blurred into a smear of rain and flashing lights. Jacob shivered uncontrollably, every nerve still expecting danger, punishment, betrayal. Years of survival instinct screamed that safety was a lie. But then the deputy spoke again, voice firm and kind. "You're not going back there, Jacob. Wherever you came from, whatever they did, it ends tonight." Jacob's throat tightened. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. The ride to the sheriff's office in Monroe was a blur. Jacob only vaguely registered the arrival of another patrol car, the concerned faces of paramedics who examined him, the soft questions he couldn't quite answer. Inside the station, they wrapped him in a warm blanket, offered him water, sat him down in a small room with bright lights and a plain wooden table. It was overwhelming. The lights, the voices, the strange smells of coffee and disinfectant. But it was real. He wasn't locked up anymore. Deputy Sanders, he finally caught the man's name, sat across from him, setting a paper cup of cocoa on the table. "You don't have to tell me everything right now," Sanders said. "But we need to know what happened, where you came from." Jacob stared at the steaming cup, struggling to find the words. When he finally spoke, it came out in broken sentences, fragments of horror. The barred windows, the forced labor, the punishments, the children who cried and were silenced, the staff who smiled for inspectors and became monsters when no one was watching. As Jacob spoke, he watched the deputy's face change, from concern to anger to cold, determined fury. Sanders didn't interrupt. He listened, really listened, giving Jacob something he hadn't felt in so long, the sense that his voice mattered. When Jacob finally finished, slumping back in the chair, Sanders leaned forward. "Jacob," he said, voice tight with controlled rage, "what you went through, it's not just wrong, it's criminal." He stood up, motioning to another officer. "We're going to take care of you, and we're going after them." Jacob clutched the blanket tighter around himself. Tears spilled down his cheeks again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of hope. As the night deepened outside and the rain finally began to ease, Jacob realized something astonishing. He had made it. He had survived. And now, he wasn't alone. For the first time, someone believed him. For the first time, there was a chance not just for escape, but for justice. The raid on the facility word traveled fast once Jacob's story reached the right ears. Deputy Sanders wasted no time. By sunrise, a full investigation team was mobilized. Detectives, social workers, officers from the Ouachita Parish Sheriff's Department, even representatives from Louisiana's Department of Children and Family Services. For too long, facilities like Hollow Creek had hidden behind glossy promises and forged compliance reports. Now, finally, someone was ready to rip the mask away. Jacob, wrapped in a warm blanket at the station, watched through the window as patrol cars gathered, lights flashing against the early morning gloom. His body was still battered and exhausted, but inside, a new strength flickered. Today, they would fight back. Today, Hollow Creek would be exposed. The convoy left Monroe in a tight formation, cutting through the misty back roads that led to the isolated property. Jacob wasn't with them. Sanders insisted he stay behind, safe. But he felt every mile they traveled like a heartbeat pounding in his ears. At Hollow Creek, morning routines were just beginning when the first sirens shattered the usual grim silence. Inside the facility, chaos erupted. Staff scrambled, shouting commands, trying to corral the confused children into locked rooms. But it was too late. Police flooded through the gates, weapons drawn, voices booming over loudspeakers. "This is the Ouachita Parish Sheriff's Department. Step away from the children. Hands where we can see them." Several staff members tried to resist, shouting about protecting the patients, waving forged medical records, but they were quickly subdued. The walls that had trapped Jacob and so many others for months couldn't hold back the law. The first officers inside were greeted with scenes straight from nightmares. Rooms with locks on the outside, children cowering in corners, flinching at every noise, beds with no sheets, no pillows, nothing but thin, stained mattresses, makeshift isolation rooms where young teens were left for hours, sometimes days, as punishment. Detectives took photos, documenting every horror. Social workers moved swiftly, comforting the terrified children, assuring them they were safe now. Jacob's descriptions had been tragically accurate. One officer opened a locked utility closet and found 2 boys, no older than 12, huddled inside, eyes wide with terror. Their wrists were bruised, their faces pale from malnutrition and fear. At the center's so-called counseling room, officers uncovered binders filled with false progress reports, fabricated documents designed to deceive families and inspectors. Not a single real therapy session had taken place. Hollow Creek had been a business of suffering, profiting from vulnerable families who trusted them. Back at the sheriff's department, Jacob sat with a social worker named Mrs. Carter, who patiently explained what was happening. "They're arresting the staff, Jacob," she said gently. "They're taking the kids out. No one will be left behind." Jacob listened, stunned as her words sank in. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. And now he was part of bringing down something monstrous. Meanwhile, at the facility, media had caught wind of the raid. News vans arrived, reporters clamoring for information. By afternoon, headlines blared across Louisiana and beyond. Private Rehabilitation Center, under investigation for abuse of special needs teens. Escape leads to major child exploitation scandal. Jacob's escape, once a desperate, lonely act, had ignited a movement he could barely comprehend. Within hours, state authorities ordered Hollow Creek closed indefinitely. All licenses were suspended, pending full criminal investigation. The staff involved in the worst abuses were arrested on the spot. Others would be hunted down in the days to come. The children, Jacob's friends, even the ones he hadn't known by name, were taken to a temporary shelter in Monroe. There, they were fed, clothed, and given real medical care for the first time in months, maybe years. Jacob insisted on writing a letter to them. With shaking hands, he scribbled, "You are not alone. You are strong. We made it out. We are free." Deputy Sanders personally delivered the letter to the shelter. That night, exhausted but awake in a hospital bed, Jacob watched news coverage of the raid. He saw footage of the gray, crumbling buildings. He saw the faces of his former captors, now in handcuffs. He saw the children, wrapped in blankets, being led gently to safety. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a fighter, a survivor, a voice that could no longer be silenced, saving other children. The news of the raid on Hollow Creek spread like wildfire. Within hours, local media outlets aired footage of the rescue operation, and by evening, the story was picked up nationwide. Jacob, sitting quietly in the hospital with a warm blanket wrapped around him, watched it all unfold on the small television mounted on the wall. He barely recognized the crumbling facility in the news footage. It looked even more broken, even more monstrous, when seen through the eyes of the outside world. And the world was finally paying attention. Over the next few days, an operation unlike anything the small town of Monroe had ever seen took shape. Teams of social workers, Therapists and volunteers swarmed the temporary shelter where the rescued children were being cared for. Doctors documented signs of abuse, malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma. Counselors spoke softly and patiently, trying to reach children who had been taught that trust was dangerous and that silence was survival. Jacob wanted desperately to see them, to tell them they weren't alone, but for now, he could only wait. Meanwhile, investigators continued to uncover horrors buried deep within Hollow Creek's walls. Hidden punishment rooms with no windows, solitary cells barely large enough for a child to lie down, forged therapy logs, financial records showing how families had been charged for specialized treatments that never existed. It was a system of exploitation, masked as care. And now, thanks to Jacob's escape, it was collapsing. One afternoon, Deputy Sanders entered Jacob's hospital room with a smile that looked almost relieved. "They want to see you," he said simply. Jacob's heart raced. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he also knew he couldn't stay away. Sanders drove him to the shelter, a nondescript building near the center of Monroe that had been transformed into a place of safety and healing. Inside, Jacob found himself surrounded by familiar faces. Emily was there, her blonde hair tucked behind her ear, her eyes wary, but no longer hollow. Tyler stood against a wall, arms crossed, but when he saw Jacob, a flicker of something almost like a smile crossed his face. Other children, those whose names Jacob had never known, turned to look at him. Some smiled shyly, some cried openly, some just stared, too overwhelmed to react. Jacob took a deep breath and stepped forward. At first, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with too much pain, too many memories. Then Emily moved. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Jacob in a tight, shaking hug. Tyler followed, clapping him awkwardly on the back. One by one, the other children joined, forming a loose, fragile circle around him. No words were needed. In that moment, they were bound by something stronger than language. A shared understanding, a shared survival. They had escaped. Together. Later, Jacob sat with a group of them, sipping hot chocolate, and listening to a counselor explain their next steps. Foster homes would be found. Therapists would work with them to heal the deep wounds left by Hollow Creek. Legal advocates would ensure they had a voice in the coming trials against their abusers. It wouldn't be easy. The scars, physical and emotional, ran deep. But for the first time, there was hope. Jacob realized that his journey wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about making sure no one else ever had to endure what they had survived. When the counselor asked if anyone wanted to share their story, Jacob was the first to speak. His voice was shaky at first, but it grew stronger as he told them everything. The labor, the punishments, the lies, the nights he spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever be free. As he spoke, he saw nods, tears, clenched fists. They understood. They lived it too. Jacob's story became their story. And slowly, one by one, they began to speak too, whispering the truths they had buried deep inside, truths that could now finally see the light. The media dubbed it the special needs survival story. Reporters praised the bravery of the children who had endured so much. Politicians promised investigations, reforms, better oversight. It wasn't just about Hollow Creek anymore. Other facilities like it across Louisiana, and even in other states, came under scrutiny. Families stepped forward with their own horror stories. Lawsuits were filed. Investigations were launched. The ripple effect of Jacob's escape grew larger with each passing day. At night, lying in his new room at the shelter, Jacob thought about the faces he had seen. The children he had helped save. They were bruised. They were broken. But they were not defeated. And neither was he. He had run for his life through the dark woods, fought fear and exhaustion, risked everything for a chance at freedom. Now, he wasn't running anymore. Now he was standing. And he wasn't standing alone. A new life and the fight for justice. The weeks that followed the raid on Hollow Creek were some of the hardest Jacob had ever faced. And some of the most important. Freedom, he quickly learned, was only the beginning. He spent his first few days in the temporary shelter, adjusting to simple things that most people took for granted. Sleeping without fear of midnight inspections, eating food that didn't come with threats, speaking without bracing for punishment. But healing wasn't instant. The scars, physical, emotional, invisible, ran deep. At night, Jacob often woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of Hollow Creek's cold walls closing in on him. Sometimes he still flinched when someone raised their voice too quickly. Sometimes he fought the instinct to apologize for speaking at all. Therapists at the shelter worked patiently with him and the other children. They encouraged them to draw, to write, to speak, to reclaim the voices they had been taught to suppress. It was during one of these sessions that Jacob first said it out loud. What they did to us. It wasn't just wrong. It was a crime. And once he said it, he couldn't stop. He wanted the world to know. The media, still following the story closely, reached out to Jacob through the shelter's administrators. At first, he hesitated, afraid of being seen, being judged, being hurt again. But something deeper urged him forward. He agreed to tell his story. Sitting in a quiet room with a kind journalist from the Monroe Times, Jacob shared everything. The exploitation disguised as therapy, the endless labor, the punishments, the broken promises. The article that followed was raw, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Headlined, "I Escaped Hollow Creek, One Boy's Fight Against Special Needs Abuse." Jacob's story sparked outrage across the state. Parents demanded accountability. Lawmakers called for immediate reforms. National disability rights organizations reached out, offering support and solidarity. Jacob realized he wasn't alone. There were others, so many others, who had been trapped in similar facilities across the country. Their voices, once silenced, were starting to rise, and Jacob wanted to help them. When a local disability rights group invited him to speak at a community meeting, Jacob said yes. He was terrified, his hands shook, his stomach churned, but he knew it was important. Standing in front of a small crowd at the Monroe Community Center, Jacob took a deep breath and began, "I was supposed to be helped. Instead, I was hurt, but I survived, and I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The room was silent as he spoke. Silent not from indifference, but from the heavy, overwhelming weight of truth. Jacob talked about the need for real oversight of private rehabilitation centers. He talked about how easy it had been for Hollow Creek to hide its horrors behind paperwork and fake smiles. He talked about the bravery of the other children, the ones who survived alongside him. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Adults with tears in their eyes approached him afterward, thanking him, telling him he was brave, telling him he was changing things. And he was. Jacob's testimony helped inspire new legislation in Louisiana aimed at protecting vulnerable children in private facilities. The Jacob Reed Act, named in his honor, proposed stricter licensing requirements, surprise inspections, and mandatory reporting standards. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't erase the past, but it was a beginning. Meanwhile, Jacob continued speaking whenever he could, at schools, at community meetings, even at a conference organized by a national disability rights coalition. Each time he spoke, his voice grew stronger. Each time he shared his story, he took back a piece of the power Hollow Creek had tried to steal from him. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days, Jacob still struggled with memories too heavy to carry, but he wasn't carrying them alone anymore. Emily found a foster family that adored her. Tyler enrolled in a school that welcomed him with open arms. Other survivors from Hollow Creek slowly built new lives, brick by fragile brick. And Jacob? He wasn't just surviving, he was leading. He dreamed of studying law one day, of becoming an advocate, a protector for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He dreamed of a world where children with disabilities weren't hidden away, weren't abused under the guise of help. He dreamed of a world where every child's voice mattered, because he knew better than anyone. Real survival isn't just about escaping the darkness. It's about lighting a path for others to follow, and Jacob Reed was just getting started.